What started as a routine traffic stop turned into something far more sinister, because these two officers didn't just pull over any driver, they pulled over the wrong woman. A black widow, cold as ice, sharper than steel, and holding more power than they could ever imagine. They thought they had control. They thought they could intimidate her. But what didn't they know? She's the mother of the most powerful man in town, and she's about to dismantle a system that's been rotten for decades. This isn't just about an arrest. It's about legacy, justice, and a reckoning years in the making. Stick around. Because the ending? You'll never see it coming. Drop a comment below. What time are you listening, and where are you tuning in from? The streets of Brookhaven, Georgia, were quiet beneath a dusky sky, the kind that bled soft lavender into steel gray as streetlights flickered on, one by one like reluctant sentinels. It was just past 9:40 p.m. when a midnight blue Lexus sedan glided down Cedar Hollow Road, its motion smooth, its rhythm steady, until a pair of headlights lit up in the rearview mirror like a warning flare. Behind the wheel sat Dr. Celeste Vaughn, 62, composed but weary, her spine straight as ever, her hands careful on the wheel. She wore a deep green coat, buttoned to the collar, and a silk scarf around her neck, the same scarf she wore to her granddaughter's school play that evening. The performance had been joyful, healing even, a rare moment of light since her husband's death the year before. But joy for Celeste never traveled alone. It always walked with its shadow. And tonight that shadow had flashing lights and a badge. She saw the patrol car before she heard the siren. It was a Ford Interceptor, dark, nondescript, except for the white lettering on the side. When its headlights surged closer, her stomach clenched, not in panic but in a familiar tightening, the kind that came not from guilt, but history. She signaled right and pulled over slowly beneath a broken street lamp near an abandoned laundromat. The flickering light stuttered overhead, casting shadows that danced across her windshield. In the mirror, the squad car stopped abruptly, its red and blue lights igniting the street in bursts of authority. Celeste exhaled deeply and reached for her license and registration, her motions deliberate and visible. She placed them on the passenger seat, where no one could mistake her intent. Her phone was already recording, discreetly propped beside her purse. She had taught her students this tactic countless times. Record. Always record. Still, she whispered a quiet prayer as she folded her hands in her lap and stared straight ahead, her expression calm but bracing for what was coming. The patrol car door swung open with force, followed by the heavy thud of boots on wet asphalt. A flashlight beam struck the rear of her Lexus, sweeping across the license plate, trunk, then up toward her rear window. The beam was aggressive, not searching, but accusing. A white man approached, tall, mid-30s, jaw set in a scowl that seemed less about her driving and more about her existence. Officer Brandon Hale. She recognized the name later. She would never forget it. He didn't greet her. He didn't ask if she was okay. The first words out of his mouth were sharp and deliberate. License and registration. Step out of the vehicle. Celeste blinked. Her voice was steady but gentle. Officer, I've placed both on the seat, clearly visible. May I ask why I'm being stopped? Hale ignored her question. I said step out of the vehicle. But I haven't been told what. Step. Outside now. The air between them crackled with more than static. It was laden with generations of unspoken memories, of traffic stops that ended in tragedy, of power flexed not for safety, but for supremacy. Still, Celeste complied. Slowly she unbuckled her seatbelt, her motions careful, precise, like one wrong twitch might shift the narrative against her. The door creaked open and the cold air rushed in. She stepped out, back straight, hands visible, dignity intact. Her eyes met Hale's, but his never truly met hers. He wasn't looking at a professor. He wasn't seeing a mother or a widow or a woman who had spent 4 decades teaching young minds how to navigate the law. He saw a profile, a category, a black woman out of place. Hands on the hood, he barked. Celeste hesitated. Officer, I haven't done anything wrong. Please. Now. From across the street behind a cracked upstairs window, 17-year-old Imani Reed watched it unfold. Her phone was already up. She'd seen this before, not with her own eyes, but through grainy viral clips. This time, it was real. This time, it was her neighborhood. Her neighbor. As Celeste pressed her palms against the hood of her own car, the heat from the engine now gone, Hale leaned in too close. His breath was sharp with tobacco and ego. "Why are you in this area tonight?" "I live in this area," she replied. "These plates are out of state." "I moved from D.C. 6 months ago, to be near my granddaughter." "Got ID to prove that?" "My Georgia license is being processed. I have the paperwork in my bag. If you're refusing to comply, that's obstruction." Celeste's jaw clenched. She had argued in federal courts. She had once been honored by a U.S. senator for her work in civil liberties. And now she stood in the dark, accused of being uncooperative, her words twisted, her presence criminalized. "I am not refusing," she said, voice still composed. "I am asserting my rights." That was when the second cruiser pulled up. Officer Dylan Mercer stepped out, older, tired-looking, his hand resting on his belt as if waiting to see if he'd need it. He didn't ask questions, just walked toward Hale and said, "What's the situation?" Hale jerked a thumb toward Celeste. "Suspicious, gave me attitude. Might be carrying false documents." "I did not give attitude," Celeste said, turning slightly, "and I am not carrying false anything." Mercer scratched his chin. "Want me to search the vehicle?" "No, you may not," Celeste replied firmly. "I do not consent to a search." Hale stepped closer, his voice a low threat. "Lady, you think you're better than everyone else. Talking all polite like that changes nothing." Celeste looked him dead in the eyes. "Knowing the law isn't arrogance, it's protection." Something snapped. Hale grabbed her wrist and turned her forcefully toward the car. The metal cuffs were ice against her skin. Her breath caught, not in pain, but in recognition. She had felt this before. Not these cuffs, not this moment, but the feeling of being silenced, stripped of humanity. "You're under detention for failure to comply and suspicion of false identification," Hale declared. "For what?" she asked, now louder, her composure cracking. "You stopped me without cause, refused to explain, escalated without reason." "You can explain yourself at the station," he spat. As the cuffs clicked into place, Imani hit upload. The video wasn't long, but it didn't have to be. It showed enough. The dignity of a woman calm and non-threatening, and the aggression of an officer determined to assert control, not uphold justice. Inside her chest, Celeste's heart thundered, not in fear, but in fury. And even as they pushed her into the back seat of the cruiser, even as the door shut like a coffin lid, she whispered to herself, "They don't know who I am." But they will. Because this wasn't just a stop. This was the spark. And history has always known what fire can do. Inside the back of the police cruiser, Dr. Celeste Vaughn sat as still as marble, the chill of the metal cuffs dug into her wrists, but she didn't shift. She didn't blink. She stared straight ahead, breathing slowly, deliberately, her back stiff against the vinyl seat. The flashing lights outside bled through the rear windows in strobes, red, blue, like a twisted lullaby of injustice. Her heartbeat echoed in her ears, not from fear, but from something far more primal, recognition. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't about a taillight or a driving error. This was about a system that didn't care who she was. A system that didn't see her doctorate, her decades of public service, her lectures on constitutional law. It only saw the color of her skin and the audacity of her confidence. Outside the cruiser, Officer Brandon Hale swaggered toward his partner, Officer Dylan Mercer, who stood leaning against the front bumper of Celeste's car, arms crossed. "She gave me lip," Hale said. Said she knows the law." Mercer raised an eyebrow. "You ran her tags?" "Not yet. Doesn't matter. I saw enough." Mercer hesitated, eyes flicking toward the camera mounted on the cruiser's dash. "We cuffing people now, just for being confident?" Hale scowled. "We're enforcing the law. She refused to exit the vehicle when ordered." "She stepped out, calm as can be." She was defiant. Hale's voice tightened. "People like that always think they're above the rules." Mercer didn't respond. Not because he agreed, but because he'd learned that silence was safer than truth in the Brookhaven Police Department. A few blocks away, Imani Reed stood trembling in her room. Her phone still clutched in her hand, screen glowing with the upload bar almost finished. The video was raw, blurry, shaky, but it caught everything. Celeste's composure, Hale's aggression, the unnecessary escalation. Her hands shook not from fear, but from something she hadn't felt before. Power. For the first time, her voice might mean something. She hit post and watched the caption take form. This happened in my neighborhood. Shepherd Justice. For Dr. Vaughn. At the precinct, word was already traveling. Officer Jordan Whitmore leaned against a vending machine as a dispatcher muttered into her headset. He saw Hale walk Celeste through the station doors, her hands cuffed, her chin lifted. She didn't shrink, even here, even now. His breath caught. It couldn't be. He stepped closer, eyes narrowing. "Excuse me," he said to the front desk clerk, nodding toward the woman being led away. "That's Dr. Celeste Vaughn." The clerk shrugged. "Brought in for obstruction or something. Hale's got her." Whitmore's jaw tightened. Dr. Vaughn had been a guest speaker at his academy, an icon in civil liberties law, the kind of legal mind most officers only read about in textbooks. She had shaken his hand once and told him, "Justice doesn't come from power. It comes from discipline." Now she was being treated like a criminal 2 blocks from her home. Inside the booking room, Hale snapped off his gloves, tossing them into the bin with theatrical flair. He never once looked at Celeste as a person. She was a case file in waiting, a line on his report. Her silence unnerved him. He wanted her to beg, to explain, to squirm. Instead, she stood, still cuffed, in front of the booking officer, her voice even but edged. "I am a law professor," she said. "My name is Dr. Celeste Vaughn. I was stopped without cause, detained without charge, and I am requesting immediate legal counsel." The booking officer looked at her, blinked, then turned to Hale. "Is this for real?" "Process her," Hale barked. "We'll sort it out later." The sound of the cuffs being tightened again was louder than it needed to be. Deliberate, ceremonial, like putting a seal on injustice. In the hallway, Whitmore made a decision. He walked to the evidence room, typed in his credentials, and retrieved a cruiser drive. He found the dashcam footage, copied it, and slid it into a private folder. Then he picked up his phone. "Internal affairs," he said to himself. "This won't sit right." In the holding room, Celeste sat on a hard bench beneath fluorescent lights. She looked around, not with panic, but with quiet fury. Her wrists throbbed, her back ached, but her eyes remained sharp. She had taught law students to stand up to injustice. Now she would live her own lesson. Then the voices started. From outside the holding room, footsteps, whispers, tension growing. The front desk phone rang. The officer on duty answered and immediately straightened. "Chief Kingsley's office," he said, confused. "Yes, sir, I understand." Then he glanced at Hale through the glass. She's already booked." Another voice came from the other end, this one louder, commanding. "This is Amara Sterling, Chief Legal Counsel to the Governor. Dr. Vaughn is a state-recognized legal advocate. I want her released. Now." Hale, pacing outside the room, didn't hear it, but Whitmore did. Inside the holding room, Celeste lifted her head. Something had shifted. She could feel it, not in the way she was being treated, but in the pressure building outside. They were beginning to realize their mistake. She had spent a lifetime building bridges between community and law, and now, ironically, she had become a case study in everything she'd fought against. Across town, the video Imani posted had started to explode. In under 45 minutes, it had 20,000 views. Comments flooded in. "That woman is a professor. I had her class. She's brilliant. How many times does this have to happen before we change the system? Brookhaven PD better explain this now." By the time Officer Hale was called into the briefing room, the dam had already cracked. "Do you know who you brought in?" a supervisor asked, voice low, eyes wide. Hale shrugged. "Some uppity lawyer." "That's Dr. Celeste Vaughn. She helped draft the police de-escalation statute you signed during training." For a moment, Hale's smug confidence cracked, and in that crack, the truth began to shine through. Back in holding, the door opened. Celeste stood but did not move. "You're being released," someone said. "Paperwork's being processed now." She tilted her head. "Because you discovered who I am, or because you realized what you did?" The officer didn't respond. Celeste walked out, her wrists sore, her pride intact. Her face unreadable, but her eyes burned with the knowledge of what had just happened and what would come next. Because this wasn't over. This was exposure. and exposure always comes before change. The walls of the Brookhaven police station had never felt so cold. Dr. Celeste Vaughn stood in the intake corridor, her wrists still red from the too tight cuffs, her dignity clinging to her like a shield, fragile, cracked, but unbroken. She had taught future attorneys, argued before state courts, and once been invited to consult on a federal policing task force. But none of that mattered here. Not now. Not under these flickering fluorescent lights and sterile gray walls that smelled of bleach and neglect. Here, she wasn't a legal scholar or a respected elder of her community. She was a suspect, another black woman with out-of-state plates and a voice deemed too calm to trust. "Move," Officer Hale muttered behind her, pressing her shoulder with more force than necessary as he guided her through the hallway like she was some dangerous flight risk. The clicking of his boots echoed like a drumbeat of authority, but beneath that rhythm was something else. Fear. Not hers, his. The fear of being questioned, the fear of losing control. And that, she realized with painful clarity, was what this was all about. Control. He needed to remind her who held the power. And she had committed the unthinkable sin of not cowering when confronted. As they passed through the bullpen, heads turned. Several younger officers lifted their eyes from their desks, only to avert them the moment Celeste met their gaze. Some looked confused, others avoided her entirely. And one, Officer Jordan Whitmore, froze when he recognized her. A woman who had once spoken at his academy graduation. A woman who had told him that courage was not just pulling someone from a burning building, but standing up when systems chose silence. She was here, in handcuffs. And something about that broke something inside him. They led her to a holding room, bare metal bench, one-way mirror, a buzzing vent in the ceiling like an anxious whisper. Hale pushed her down onto the bench with a muttered, "Sit." Then he left. No explanation, no charge, just silence. Celeste folded her hands in her lap, steadying herself. Her palms were damp with sweat, her heart tight with grief and anger that threatened to rise like a wave, but she didn't let it. Not yet. Instead, she did what she always did when faced with cruelty. She studied it. She dissected it. She understood that this moment was no accident. It was the symptom of a disease too many still pretended didn't exist. Outside the room, Officer Whitmore approached the front desk. "Who brought her in?" he asked the sergeant. "Hale," the sergeant said without looking up. "Says she was non-compliant, obstruction, refused a vehicle search." Whitmore's brow furrowed. "That woman is Dr. Celeste Vaughn." That made the sergeant pause. "The civil rights professor?" Whitmore nodded. A beat of tension passed between them. The sergeant looked down. "Well, it's Hale. You know how he gets." And that was the problem. Everyone knew how he got, and no one had done a damn thing about it. Whitmore walked away, jaw clenched, fury simmering beneath his uniform. He made his way to the evidence room, scanned his badge, and pulled up cruiser footage from Hale's dash cam. The file played across a small screen. Celeste compliant, polite, deliberate in her every movement. Hale escalating, Hale lying, Hale detaining her without cause. Whitmore grabbed a flash drive and copied the file. Then he slipped it into his pocket like it was dynamite, because it was. Back in the holding room, Celeste stared at her reflection in the one-way glass. Her eyes searched for her own humanity, but the lighting, the sterile metal, the very nature of this space had been designed to erase it. She thought about her late husband, Harold, a judge, a man who believed in systems, who trusted that justice could be achieved if only you were smart enough, patient enough, dignified enough. And here she was, dignified and still in a cage. She thought of her students. How many times had she told them to remain calm, to assert their rights respectfully, to trust the process? How many of those lectures now felt like broken promises? She closed her eyes just for a moment and exhaled. Then the door opened. A young officer stepped inside. Not Hale, not Mercer, it was Whitmore. His face was pale, tense, eyes heavy with something that resembled remorse. "Dr. Vaughn," he said softly. She looked up, guarded. I just want you to know," he said, lowering his voice. "What happened out there, what they did, it's on camera, and I have it." Her eyes didn't soften. "Then don't just have it," she said. "Do something with it." Whitmore nodded, ashamed. I already made a copy, he whispered. I'm going to Internal Affairs. Tonight. Then make sure it doesn't disappear, she said quietly. Truth tends to get misplaced in rooms like this. He paused, then turned and left. A few minutes later, Chief Robert Kingsley burst through the precinct doors, a phone still in his hand and panic scribbled across his face. Where is she? He barked. The sergeant pointed. Holding room 3. Kingsley shoved past desks and startled officers until he reached the door. He flung it open. Celeste didn't move. Dr. Vaughn, he said, out of breath. I deeply, deeply apologize. We're releasing you immediately. There's been a terrible error. She stood slowly, her gaze piercing. Error? She said. You call this an error? Kingsley stammered. We didn't realize... No, you didn't care, she said, voice low but lethal. And now that the world knows who I am, you're scrambling. I assure you this will be investigated fully. You assure me of nothing, Chief, she said, stepping past him. I'll wait for the assurance from your department's public apology. I'll wait for it in writing. Signed, with policy change attached. And she walked out, her head held high, her voice unshaken, her fury intact. As she stepped into the cool night, cameras were already gathering. Imani's video had exploded online, nearly 200,000 views in 2 hours. Reporters were calling, advocates were marching. The city was shifting, and in the stillness of the precinct, Officer Whitmore walked into the Internal Affairs office with a flash drive in hand and fire in his gut. The storm had begun. And Celeste Vaughn? She wasn't a victim. She was a fuse. The silence in the Brookhaven police station was deceptive, thick, sterile, and humming with fluorescent light. But beneath it, tension simmered, like an underground wire about to blow. Dr. Celeste Vaughn stood just beyond the front desk, newly uncuffed, her wrist tender and marked with the red imprints of steel. She hadn't said a word since the chief's stammered apology. She didn't need to. Her eyes, dark and unflinching, spoke louder than any outburst ever could. The officers around her, some watching in hushed shame, others pretending not to see her, could feel it in their bones. The air was changing, and not in their favor. In a side office down the hall, Chief Robert Kingsley was pacing like a man who just realized the floor beneath him was glass, and cracking. His shirt clung to his back with sweat. On his desk a landline rang, not the general line, the private one, the one only a handful of people had access to. His eyes snapped to it. The red light blinked like a flare, a silent warning. He picked it up. "Kingsley!" he barked. The voice on the other end was calm, too calm, controlled like a surgeon's scalpel. "This is Mayor Langston Vaughn. I believe you have, or had, my mother in custody." The chief froze. The words landed like bricks. He started, suddenly breathless. "Mayor Vaughn, I can explain." "No, you can't," came the reply, low and lethal. "Because there is no explanation that justifies dragging a retired civil rights attorney, a university professor, and a grieving black mother from her car, handcuffing her on camera, and holding her in custody without cause. That's not protocol, that's not policing, that's profiling. And you just made it national." Kingsley tried to swallow. His tongue felt thick. The mayor's voice wasn't raised, but the weight of it could crush a building. "We didn't know—" "You knew enough," the mayor cut in. "You knew her license was valid. You knew she posed no threat. You knew she cooperated. What you didn't know was who she was. And now you're going to learn what that mistake will cost you." The line went dead. In the station hallway, an unnatural hush settled. Word was spreading, first among the desk officers, then the command staff. Everyone knew who Langston Vaughn was. Young, black, and brilliant. The youngest mayor in Georgia's history. A former federal prosecutor. A man not known for his temper, but whose wrath, when summoned, was precise and merciless. A storm in a tailored suit. And now the storm had a reason. At the front of the station, Celeste stood with her hands gently clasped in front of her. She didn't pace, didn't speak. She simply waited. She had learned long ago that some forms of power weren't loud. They didn't roar or threaten. They just were, like a mountain in the path of a flood. Behind her, Officer Jordan Whitmore emerged from the internal affairs corridor. His expression was tight, controlled, but his eyes burned with purpose. He approached her slowly. "I just submitted the footage," he said, voice quiet. "Everything from the dash cam and my own personal report. It's in their hands now." Celeste turned to him. There was pain in her expression. Old pain, not from that night, but from 1,000 nights just like it. Her voice was soft, but unwavering. "Will they do anything with it?" Whitmore hesitated. "I don't know, but I will." She nodded once. "Then don't flinch." Before he could reply, the glass station doors flew open, and in walked Mayor Langston Vaughn. The room shifted. He didn't come with an entourage. He didn't need one. He moved like a man who knew the cameras would catch up soon. Dressed in a charcoal suit, his tie still knotted, but slightly loosened as if he'd left another meeting mid-sentence. His steps echoed through the lobby, like a gavel striking wood. "Where is she?" he asked. Celeste turned. For the first time all night, her face cracked. Not with anger, but with something far more personal. Relief. Recognition. Safety. "Langston," she said, her voice catching. He reached her in 2 strides and wrapped his arms around her tightly, as if afraid the world might try to take her again. "I came as soon as I heard," he murmured. "Are you okay?" "I am now," she said softly. Chief Kingsley appeared seconds later, flustered and pale. "Mayor Vaughn, Langston turned to him, releasing his mother slowly, then stepped forward. "You're done speaking," he said coldly. "For now, you're going to listen, because this isn't a courtesy visit. This is a warning. What happened to my mother tonight, what your officers did under your command, is now under official investigation. And if even one report is altered, if even one piece of evidence goes missing, I will make sure your badge and your pension vanish before sunrise." Kingsley's mouth opened, then shut again. "You will issue a public apology," Langston continued. "You will release all video footage to the media, and you will suspend Officer Hale immediately pending review. If not, you'll be answering to the Attorney General by morning." "Mayor, please," Kingsley's voice cracked. "You have to understand the pressure we're under." "No," Langston snapped. "You don't get to talk about pressure to the son of a black woman who had to wait in a cell for you to remember her humanity." The room stood still. The quiet that followed was different this time. Not fear, but reckoning. Langston turned to his mother. "Let's go." Celeste nodded, her chin lifting, her shoulders squaring. The pain in her wrists still pulsed, but it no longer controlled her steps. As they moved toward the exit, the eyes of every officer followed them, some ashamed, some angry, some simply stunned that the woman they dismissed as another mouthy black woman had become the axis of a nationwide storm. Outside, the air was thick with humidity and the buzz of distant voices. News vans were already pulling in. Protesters were gathering. Candles were being lit. The image of Celeste walking calmly beside her son, the mayor of the city that tried to cage her, was already going viral. Back inside, Whitmore walked to the window and watched them disappear into the night. Then he turned and headed back toward internal affairs. There was more to say, more to uncover. This was only the beginning. And justice, true justice, was no longer optional. By morning, Brookhaven was no longer just a name on a map. It was a headline, a battleground, a boiling point. The video had detonated like a bomb. Shot in shaky vertical footage from Imani Reed's second-story window, the clip was less than 3 minutes long, but it didn't need to be longer. It showed enough. Dr. Celeste Vaughn's calm compliance, Officer Hale's commanding tone escalating without cause, the moment she was cuffed beside her own car, and the final unforgettable image, her standing motionless beneath flashing red and blue lights, like a monument to something sacred, being desecrated in real time. By 7:42 a.m., Justice for Drevillon was trending on every major platform. By 8 a.m., news vans were parked outside the police station. And by noon, it had gone national. Cable news panels aired the footage on loop, with commentators pausing only to express stunned disbelief or unfiltered outrage. Civil rights attorneys were already calling it a textbook case of racial profiling. Others said it was predictable. Too many could recall too many names: Sandra, Brianna, Atatiana, names that had become hashtags, then murals, then warnings. And now Celeste Vaughn's name joined them. Not as a victim of violence, but of a system that still insisted on punishing black women for standing tall. Inside her modest home, Celeste sat at the kitchen table, the morning sun leaking in through half-drawn curtains. Her phone buzzed nonstop. Messages from former students, colleagues, journalists. Her alma mater had already issued a statement of support. The local NAACP chapter had scheduled a march for Saturday, but she wasn't thinking about any of that. Her eyes were locked on the folded napkin in front of her, her tea untouched, her fingers still trembling slightly from the adrenaline that hadn't quite worn off. She should have cried, but there were no tears. She should have been angry, but anger felt insufficient. What sat in her chest was deeper, older, a hollow ache that whispered, "You knew this would happen again." You always knew. Langston walked in, sleeves rolled up, his tie forgotten, a phone pressed to his ear. "Yes, Congressman, she's fine, shaken but fine. Yes, we're taking action. No, I don't want this turned into a soundbite." He hung up, exhaled, and knelt beside her. "Mom," he said, gently touching her hand. "They're asking if you'll speak at the press conference." Celeste didn't look up. "I already spoke," she whispered. "They just refused to listen." Langston swallowed hard. He had spent years crafting speeches, delivering policy, defending others. But he had never once imagined having to defend his own mother from the very system he swore to improve. "I need you to be heard now," he said quietly. Celeste finally looked at him. Her voice was tired but fierce. "Being heard doesn't protect us, Langston. We've been heard for centuries. What we haven't been is believed." That afternoon, Officer Brandon Hale arrived at the station expecting business as usual. Instead, he found 2 internal affairs investigators waiting at the front desk with clipboards and unreadable faces. "Officer Hale," one said, "you're being placed on administrative leave, effective immediately, pending investigation into misconduct, racial bias, and unlawful detainment." "What?" Hale scoffed, eyes scanning the room. "You've got to be kidding." The lead investigator didn't blink. "You're entitled to union representation, but you'll surrender your badge and weapon now." As Hale unhooked his duty belt, every eye in the room was on him. Not one officer spoke. Not one offered him support. In a corner of the precinct, Officer Jordan Whitmore watched the moment unfold. There was no satisfaction in his face, only gravity. He knew this wasn't the end. Hale was just a symptom. The disease ran deeper. Later that evening, a candlelight vigil formed outside City Hall. Hundreds gathered, neighbors, students, professors, parents with children bundled against the chill. They didn't chant. They didn't scream. They just stood. Some held photos of Celeste. Others held signs that read, "Who protects us from the protected?" and "She teaches the law." They broke it. Celeste didn't plan to attend, but as the crowd swelled and the voices grew louder, she stood at her door, heart pounding with the weight of history. "I'm not ready," she told Langston. "You don't have to be," he said. "They are." And so she went. When she stepped onto the courthouse steps, the crowd parted like a sea. All eyes turned to her, not as a symbol, but as a witness, a woman who had lived through the system's promise and its betrayal. She stood before the microphones. No speech, no notes, just truth. "I was not pulled over for a traffic violation," she said. "I was pulled over for existing in a space someone didn't believe I belonged in." She paused. "And the tragedy is not that this happened to me. The tragedy is that it could have happened to any of you. And it already has." A murmur ran through the crowd. "I'm not here to ask for apologies. I'm here to demand accountability, because if this system cannot recognize my dignity, not as a scholar, not as a mother, not as a human being, then it needs to be dismantled and rebuilt." A long silence followed. Then, slowly, the applause began. First in ripples, then waves. Later that night, Celeste sat on her porch as dusk settled over the town, her scarf wrapped tightly around her neck, the bruises on her wrists faint but visible. Imani Reed approached quietly, her phone in her pocket. "I didn't mean to go viral," she said. Celeste smiled faintly. "You didn't go viral. The truth did." And in that quiet moment under the stars, something shifted, not just in Brookhaven but in Celeste. The shame they tried to put on her no longer belonged to her. The helplessness they assumed she'd carry had been returned, and the fear they counted on had turned into something else. Resolve. Because fallout isn't just destruction. Sometimes it's exposure. Sometimes it's the beginning of change. And for Celeste Vaughn, this was no longer about justice for one woman. It was about justice for every woman who had ever been told to lower her voice, prove her worth, or explain her right to simply be. Rain tapped steadily against the windows of Brookhaven City Hall like a quiet metronome counting down to a reckoning. Inside the chamber, the air felt stiff with tension. Too many suits, too many cameras, and too little space between decorum and outrage. The gallery was packed. Journalists scribbled furiously, community members sat shoulder to shoulder, and rows of law students leaned forward in hushed anticipation. No one was here to be entertained. They were here because something had broken. And for once, the silence that followed injustice had been interrupted by evidence too powerful to ignore. At the front of the room sat the Oversight Committee, 7 chairs arranged behind a long, polished bench, each occupied by city officials, legal observers, and a representative from the State Attorney General's office. In the center sat Chairwoman Nadine Hollis, a sharp-eyed woman whose background in civil rights litigation preceded her like a storm warning. She leaned into the mic with solemn precision. This hearing will review the conduct of Officer Brandon Hale, the incident involving Dr. Celeste Vaughn, and the broader question of racially biased policing within the Brookhaven Police Department. Her words dropped like stones into still water. Celeste sat in the front row, not behind the witness table yet. Her time would come. She wore a navy blue suit, the same one she'd worn when she gave her first university lecture 30 years ago. It still fit, barely. But that wasn't the point. The suit, like her, had weathered years of expectation, scrutiny, and dismissal. Now it carried something else entirely, proof of survival. Her fingers were clasped tight in her lap. Langston sat beside her, jaw clenched, eyes unmoving. Behind them, supporters filled every available seat. Some held candles, others wore shirts with her name, and a few carried simple cardboard signs that read, "Dignity isn't a threat." When Chairwoman Hollis called the first witness, the room shifted. Officer Jordan Whitmore. He stood, walked slowly to the front, and sat down at the testimony table. Cameras clicked in rhythmic flashes. Whitmore cleared his throat. "I joined the Brookhaven Police Department 6 years ago. I believe in protecting the public. But what I witnessed on the night of Dr. Vaughn's arrest wasn't protection. It was ego. It was racial profiling. It was abuse of authority, plain and simple," he went on. He recounted everything. His recognition of Dr. Vaughn the moment she entered the station, the expression on Hale's face, the dash cam footage he submitted to Internal Affairs, and the sealed complaints he'd quietly started uncovering. He spoke like a man who had been holding his breath for years, and now he exhaled truth. When Hollis asked why he hadn't spoken out sooner, his voice dropped. "Because in our department, silence is rewarded. But after that night, I couldn't stay silent anymore." The room held still. No coughs, no shuffles, just tension and a growing realization. This wasn't about one officer or one night. It was about all of it. Next came Maria Santiago, a single mother who had been pulled over by Officer Hale 3 times in 6 months. Each time she was accused of driving a stolen vehicle. Each time she was let go without citation. Her voice shook, but her words were sharp. "I cried all the way home with my kids in the back seat. You don't forget how it feels to be treated like a criminal in front of your own children." Then came Earl Thompson, a retired Vietnam veteran who had been stopped on suspicion of walking too slow outside a hardware store. And Devin Brooks, a high school honor student accused of loitering near his own mailbox. Their stories stacked one atop the other like bricks in a dam built to hold back a flood of long-ignored truth. Finally, Chairwoman Hollis spoke again. "Dr. Celeste Vaughn, would you please approach the table?" Celeste stood slowly. The room didn't erupt, but it did lean forward, as if the very air wanted to hear her more clearly. She sat, adjusted the microphone, and then paused. Her hands rested gently on the tabletop, fingers still trembling slightly. Not with fear, with memory. "I've spent my life studying the law," she began, her voice even, resonant. "I've defended young men accused unjustly. I've helped draft policy meant to protect citizens. And I've stood in courtrooms demanding that this system live up to the promises written into our Constitution." She leaned forward slightly. But on that night, none of it mattered. Not my degrees, not my record, not my calm demeanor. The only thing that mattered was that I was black, and I was visible. A hush fell. I was handcuffed on the side of the road, my dignity stripped in front of homes where I shop, worship, and vote. I was spoken to like I was beneath the badge, and when I asked why, I was ignored. Her voice didn't rise, it didn't need to. The weight of her words pressed into the room like gravity. "I am not asking for vengeance," she said. "I am asking for acknowledgement, that what happened to me was not rare. It was just recorded. And if you don't act, if this hearing ends in words without accountability, then it means nothing." A long pause. Then she added more softly, "I do not speak for myself alone. I speak for the women who can't anymore, the ones who didn't survive their stop, the ones who did but were never believed." The applause was hesitant at first, uncertain, like it was waiting for permission. Then it surged, wave after wave. Some people stood, some wiped tears, others simply bowed their heads as if in prayer. Chairwoman Hollis leaned into the mic again. "This committee thanks you, Doctor Vaughn." Celeste stood slowly, turning back to her son, who rose to meet her with a quiet nod. Not pride, not even victory, just solidarity. Because this wasn't over, but it had begun. And in that courtroom, beneath the harsh lights, before the gaze of a community too long asked to wait, something cracked open. Not justice, not yet. But the door. And Celeste Vaughn, once dragged into that station like she didn't belong, had just walked back through it on her own terms, with the truth in one hand and history watching in the other. The courthouse was at capacity. Outside, a crowd of nearly 1,000 packed the courthouse lawn, umbrellas pressed shoulder to shoulder beneath a steel-gray sky. Inside, the gallery overflowed with community members, students, reporters, and quiet survivors, each one bracing for what they hoped would be a turning point, and fearing it might not be. A storm hovered above Brookhaven, not of weather, but of consequence. This was the final hearing, the final vote. At the center of it all sat Dr. Celeste Vaughn, front row, still, unblinking. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her navy suit immaculate, despite the strain of the past weeks. There were new lines on her face, shadows under her eyes. But her gaze remained unchanged, steady, piercing, unafraid. What had begun as a routine traffic stop had become a national firestorm. Protests had swept through Brookhaven. Videos had been dissected frame by frame on every news network. The mayor's office had received over 12,000 emails. The governor had made a statement. The Department of Justice had called. And now it came down to this room, these walls, this moment. Chairwoman Nadine Hollis took her seat at the head of the oversight panel. The gavel hit wood with a single sharp crack. This committee is now in session. The atmosphere was electric but tense, as if the entire building had taken a collective breath and was holding it hostage. Celeste leaned forward just slightly, her body taut with anticipation, the weight of history pressing against her spine. She thought of her late husband, Harold, who had died believing the system he helped shape could be redeemed. She thought of every courtroom she'd ever stood in, every injustice she'd named, every time she told her students to believe that justice, however slow, could still prevail. Now she wasn't sure. Chairwoman Hollis adjusted the mic. After reviewing the testimonies of affected citizens, department officers, and expert witnesses, after examining sealed complaints, internal reports, and body cam evidence, this committee has reached a unanimous decision. A beat passed. No one moved. 1. Officer Brandon Hale is to be formally terminated with immediate effect and referred to the State Attorney General's Office for criminal prosecution on charges of civil rights violations, unlawful detention, and abuse of authority. The room exploded, not with noise, but with breath. A long, stifled exhale finally released. But Hollis continued. 2. An independent federal review of Brookhaven Police Department's past 5 years of traffic stops, arrests, and complaints will be launched, with full access to all records previously sealed or redacted. Whispers echoed through the room. Officers shifting uncomfortably in the back, citizens reaching for one another's hands. 3. Effective immediately, a civilian accountability board comprised of local residents, elected community leaders, and civil rights professionals will oversee all misconduct complaints and departmental disciplinary actions. And finally, 4. The town of Brookhaven will establish a public, permanent community justice center, funded by the city, led by citizens, and named in honor of Dr. Celeste Vaughn. This time the silence shattered. Applause rose like thunder, first hesitant, then resounding, growing into a roar that filled every corner of the chamber. People stood. Some clapped with tears in their eyes. Others pressed hands over mouths in disbelief. Students cried openly. And amid them all, Celeste sat motionless, hands still folded, eyes shimmering, her throat tight, with the emotion she had refused to let show until now. Langston stood behind her, his hand resting on her shoulder. For weeks he had fought for her, spoken on her behalf, carried her story into backroom meetings and press briefings. But now, watching his mother honored in the name of justice, not pity, he felt something he hadn't since childhood. Awe. Celeste stood slowly. The crowd hushed again. She turned to face them, not as a symbol, not as a case study, but as a woman who had once been cuffed in the dark and now stood in the light. "I did not ask for this," she said. "I did not plan to become the beginning of anything. I just wanted to be allowed to go home. But you don't get to choose the moment when history calls your name. You only get to choose whether you answer." The room fell completely still. "My story is not unique," she continued. "It is shared by every person who's been made to feel small behind flashing lights. Every mother who taught her child how to survive a traffic stop instead of how to drive. Every grandmother who walks with her back straighter than her heart allows, because she knows that being dignified doesn't always protect you. But looking vulnerable might get you killed." Her voice cracked then, just slightly. She paused, collected herself, then delivered the final blow. They thought they were detaining a woman. What they didn't know is they were detaining a movement. The crowd rose again, not in chaos, but in unity. Outside, bells rang from the old church tower. Cars honked in solidarity. The sun finally broke through the clouds. And in that moment, justice didn't feel finished, but it felt possible. Later that night, Celeste returned to her home. She stood in the doorway alone for a long moment, her hand resting on the doorframe like she needed to remember how it felt to walk into her house without fear. The porch lights were on, the lawn freshly cut, and pinned to her mailbox was a note, handwritten, unsigned. It said, "Because you stood, I finally did too." She smiled. Not because it was over, but because something, finally, had begun. The story of Dr. Celeste Vaughn echoes the lived reality of countless Black Americans today. Individuals who, despite their accomplishments, face racial profiling simply for existing in spaces others deem off-limits. Her wrongful arrest, quiet strength, and ultimate vindication expose a truth we can no longer ignore, that dignity, education, and lawfulness do not shield Black bodies from bias. In a time when trust in policing is deeply fractured, this story reminds us that silence in the face of injustice enables its continuation. The lesson? We must speak up, document abuse, and demand accountability, not just for ourselves, but for those who can't. Whether it's sharing a video, filing a complaint, voting for reform, or simply believing the voices long silenced, change begins when ordinary people refuse to look away. Because when we stand beside the truth, we don't just expose what's broken, we begin to rebuild what's possible. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, give it a like and comment one if you found the story meaningful. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. See you in the next one.